This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for being here. We've got another great program for you today, but before we get started, I just wanted to mention that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more articles and podcasts about the larger trends of politics, religion, media, and society. And if you like what we're doing here, you can go to theoryofchange.show, where you can subscribe to the mailing list for free on Substack, or you can support the show for a little bit extra per month on Substack or on Patreon. And I do appreciate everybody who is doing that. And if you can't afford to subscribe, you can please, I would definitely appreciate it if you could spread word of the show. Let your friends and your family and hell, even your enemies know what we're doing here. I appreciate it. And if you're on YouTube, be sure to click the like and subscribe button as well, so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode posted. Okay, all right. So with that out of the way, let's get into today's program. In recent years, we have seen the rise of a new kind of left-wing pundit, one whose audience consists almost entirely of right-wingers. And there is a good reason for that. Almost every one of these people do nothing but criticize Democrats. And this is despite calling themselves progressives or liberal. And this is also a thing that exists in other countries as well, like the UK and Canada even. So it's an interesting thing to explore and to think about. And as it happens, there's a long history of this on the political left, and I'm happy to bring on to discuss this with me David Masciotra. He is a writer and author, and he recently wrote a piece in the New Republic that we're going to discuss. And he's also written about this topic over the years. And also, interestingly and relevant to this conversation, he's also he had a libertarian phase as well. So this is going to be an interesting discussion. Thanks for being here, David.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, so let's, I guess, set the table here with, you wrote a piece last year for CNN in which you talked about the fan fiction left. What did you mean by that?
Well, with the term, in case any of your viewers don't know, fan fiction is a genre of writing in which fans of a series of novels or a television series or a series of films, could be Harry Potter or The Sopranos, start to write their own stories, perhaps to continue the storyline of the characters if the program ends or the author announces that a recent installment was the final in the series of novels. So by fan fiction left, I'm describing a particular breed of American leftists, or at least they identify themselves as leftists. And you're right to say they exist in other countries, but I'm most familiar with American political discourse, who've created a fictional universe in which they live and operate, and they base assumptions that they have on that fictional universe, on those false precepts. So in the CNN essay, I was referring specifically to people who spend all of their time castigating Democrats while claiming they're progressives for the failures of our healthcare system, for the failures of our criminal justice system, for the rising rates of economic inequality, while conveniently ignoring that it is Democrats who, while not perfect, no political party is, are striving to address, mitigate, and even solve those problems. But they're colliding with the obstructionism of increasingly partisan, but also increasingly violent and hateful Republicans. And so there are a few principles of the fan fiction left. For example, when the Supreme Court revoked Roe versus Wade and overturned that decision, you saw certain people like Crystal Ball, the She identifies as a left-wing populist. She's co-host of a program called Breaking Points with a right-wing populist. You saw Brianna Joy Gray, former spokesperson for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and several others lambast the Democratic Party for not codifying Roe versus Wade without ever acknowledging that it's Republican appointees to the Supreme Court who voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. It's Democratic appointees to the Supreme Court who voted to preserve it. And at almost no point within the last 30 to 40 years did Democrats even have the votes to codify federally protected abortion. And should they have tried to have done that, it certainly would have gone to the courts, and their right-wing justices would have overturned it. So they created, I'm using that example to show they created this fictional universe, and then they make ideological assertions based upon that fictional universe. Whereas here in the real world, the reason, of course, that Roe versus Wade is no longer on the books and no longer protecting women's right to choose an abortion is because of right-wing Supreme Court justices, the presidents who appointed them, and Mitch McConnell's refusal to give Merrick Garland a hearing, and all of those other incidents and issues that we could tick down the list.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I would maybe push back a little bit on this particular point, just simply because, I mean, they could have done what Republicans did, which was pass trigger laws, as they called them, that said if Roe versus Wade is overturned, then this would happen. And those can't really be litigated because, well, the case was still in precedent. But you know, I think it is a very fair criticism on, you know, a lot of the other issues. So whether that's, you know, why can't we have, you know, universal health care magically? You know, there is this idea of we're going to force the vote. Oops, sorry, I just knocked my keyboard. We're gonna force the vote, as they called it, to make Democrats go on the record as to whether they support universal health care or not, even though they knew that they would lose that vote.
Yes.
And it's like, let's say that it had happened, that basically what they would have done is damage their cause. Because basically it would have shown that, you know, all of these people can go and vote against universal health care and nothing will happen to them. Because you don't have the infrastructure to stop them or to push back on them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's a general lack of awareness and recognition of the way in which government works, the way in which politics works. And perhaps most consequentially, there's a lack of concern about the people who stand to lose the most, according to this all or nothing philosophy. So if we take a look at healthcare, the Affordable Care Act barely passed during the Obama administration. It passed by a very small amount of votes. Very famously, it was almost overturned during the Trump administration. Senator John McCain saved it with the iconic thumbs down moment on the Senate floor. The people who would say, well, we need to have Medicare for all or nothing. And people were saying that at the time that Democrats were saying that, or I should say at least so-called progressives were saying it, at the time that the Affordable Care Act passed. They don't even seem to deal with the fact that through the Affordable Care Act, over 20 million Americans gained access to health care coverage for the first time. The Affordable Care Act, while it certainly has its flaws, and while there are certainly still some pretty big cracks in the canvas of the Affordable Care Act through which people can fall, it has literally saved the lives of millions of people. And it was under the restraints on the Obama administration and congressional Democrats at the time it really was the best that they could do. Had they gone for a public option at the time, Susan Collins, Murkowski, and others would have voted against it. Should they try to force the vote and, in the false belief that they're exercising some kind of sophisticated form of brinksmanship, as you just pointed out, it would actually hurt the cause, and it would do nothing to help people who so desperately need medicine to acquire it. So people who so desperately need to be able to go see a doctor, to get to a doctor. So another part of the fan fiction aspect is a detachment from the real consequences of the political process. So it's a world of theory, and oftentimes the theory sounds good on paper, but in practice it's disastrous. It doesn't have an on-the-ground application.
The other thing about this is that, and why I think the fan fiction metaphor is appropriate, is that fan fiction is, sort of dependent on another work, somebody else's creativity, somebody else's system. And in this sense, they don't have a system that they want to create. So I can't fault them for wanting to have, universal health care. And it's fair to blame, Democrats for not delivering on the promises that they made. I mean, it is fair and 100% true that many of these senators, like Kamala Harris, had endorsed Bernie Sanders's bill. So it's appropriate to be upset at them for having betrayed what they said they would do. But if you don't have a system that can actually mete out punishment or can mobilize people in favor of your ideas, then all you're doing is you're just tacking on to somebody else's game, and then you're whining at them for not going along with rules that favor you. And that's how it's similar to fan fiction. Fan fiction is dependent on the creativity, the fiction of somebody else, a system that someone else built. And look, and it's a fun thing for people, but it is not literarily as high of a form. It just simply is not, it doesn't deserve as much respect.
Yeah, and I think that another way that we could criticize Democrats, before I get to your broader point, is for their rhetorical timidity. So you raised a very good example, and another one is that we could look at, for example, President Joe Biden. He has said many times that he wants to create tuition-free community colleges. That's a wonderful idea. As I wrote a book on Jesse Jackson, that was part of his campaign for the presidency in the 1980s, and it was called radical and fringe and extreme at the time and impractical. Well, now it's become rather mainstream within the Democratic Party, but it's something that key figures mention now and then, and they don't aggressively advocate for it. So I think that's a very fair criticism of the Democratic Party, that they do have this rhetorical passivity in which they don't pursue arguments using the bully pulpit and using their power of sociocultural influence as they should. But unless one can actually delineate a strategy, delineate exactly how we get from, back to healthcare, for example, the Affordable Care Act barely passing and then barely surviving, to creating Medicare for all, then, as you're saying, it's just kind of a fun distraction, but it has very significant, serious consequences, because people who are in the audience of these fan fiction pundits are taking that analysis very seriously. And if they turn against the Democratic Party for reasons that are illegitimate and for reasons that are specious, that can have very destructive real-world effects, because we're in a battle right now for the survival of democracy against a Republican Party that is increasingly extreme, increasingly hostile to democratic norms and institutions, and increasingly willing to either defend or downplay violence as a political instrument of change. And I would return to something referencing Jesse Jackson again. He's always been to the left of most mainstream Democratic Party figures, but he's put it very simply using a sports metaphor that we do better, we meaning the progressive left, we do better when we can play offense rather than defense. And when Republicans have power, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, the best that left of center activists and officials can do is play defense. And we saw that during 4 disastrous years of the Trump administration and 8 disastrous years during the Bush administration. When Democrats are in power, what activists who'd like to see the party move to the left should do, instead of reserving all of their vitriol for Democrats and imagining a world of make-believe in which Biden or before him Obama could just wave a magic wand and create transformative institutional change, is start pressuring Democratic congresspeople, Democratic senators, to adopt more progressive positions and to live up to those promises that they made.
And I think the one of the things when you look at a lot of the rhetoric and the people who are kind of spouting this stuff, they don't seem to have a very good understanding of politics. Like these are people that, I mean, in the case of Jimmy Dore, this is a stand-up comedian. You've got people who, by and large, do not have experience winning elections. By and large, do not have policy experience. These are people that politics is more kind of a form of self-expression rather than victory. I think I would say, or would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And something rather unfortunate and bizarre has happened in left-wing punditry. When I was in high school and college, and George W. Bush was president, and there was an anti-war movement, and people were becoming, for good reason, highly critical of the Bush administration, particularly his national security policies. The leading pundits on the left were people like, and I mean what some would classify as far left. I don't mean the equivalent of MSNBC today, but it was people like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, people like Michael Eric Dyson, Cornel West, Amy Goodman in Democracy Now! She's still going, but she doesn't seem to have the audience that some of these, like Breaking Points and Jimmy Dore have. And these were people, whether one likes Chomsky or Zinn or Dyson, they came from an academic background. They attempted to infuse into all of their work an understanding of statistical evidence, an understanding of government, an understanding of history. And they made substantive contributions to the discourse. But you're exactly right that it's almost now become a form of self-expression, and I would add to it infotainment. These people are more entertainers than intellectuals. And Neil Postman wrote a book a long time ago with the title Amusing Ourselves to Death. Jimmy Dore is a perfect example of someone who is a clever wordsmith. He's a clever comedian, and he applies that to a political ecosystem that rewards a short attention span, and it rewards binary thinking. So the Democratic Party is either a soulless, corporately captured, useless party putting on a false front of progressivism while they secretly make deals with, multinational corporations, or they aren't. Whereas the reality is much more complicated. There are Democrats who are much friendlier to multinational corporations than others, but the way in which politics works requires negotiation, it requires compromise, and it often requires gradual change. We have undergone in the past 60 years a series of soft revolutions, namely civil rights for Blacks and Latinos, and for the disabled, and for women, and for LGBTQ Americans. Well, these things happened gradually. And that's another problem with what I'm calling the fan fiction left, is they seem to, whether they're sincere or not, and we can't look inside these people's hearts and minds, but they seem to advocate for, we need everything right now. And if we don't get everything right now, well, then that in itself is condemnation of anyone working within the system. Well, there are some changes that I wish we could get in their entirety right at this instant. But unfortunately, it's not how the system works, and it's not how history moves in almost any country, barring a full-scale, often violent revolution. And I don't think anybody is under the impression that that's imminent in the United States. So here again, we return to a point of a general ignorance, whether it's feigned or sincere, of the way that politics works and the way that progressive political change happens.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, that is in part why I called this show Theory of Change, because there's basically, so both the sort of center left and the progressive left, their analyses are actually both correct. And that is the problem, is that neither side understands the other one is also correct. Like, it isn't a choice between, one way or the other. They're actually both true. So it is the case that, you have tens of millions of people who are disaffected from American politics because they don't have they don't have healthcare. They don't have, access to schooling. They don't have access to affordable housing. And it's made them, rightfully depressed about that. One of the great activists, civil rights activists, Bayard Rustin, he said something that I think is very key to keep in mind. He said that we must understand that demoralization in the Negro community is largely a common sense response to an objective reality. And he was right about that. But at the same time, he also did understand that if you want to make larger systemic change, you have to have a theory of change. You can't just wish that it were the case. You have to make it be the case. And in that sense, so there is basically lacking a sort of a systemic change-oriented progressive movement right now. That doesn't really exist. And as you talked about in your CNN piece last year, you mentioned that was something that George Orwell, the English socialist, encountered in the mid 20th century. As you noted in your essay, so Orwell was a socialist, but he came to the opinion that the left in his era in England, they viewed politics as, quote, a masturbation fantasy in which the world of facts hardly matters.
Yes, yeah, and that's back to that is a great and colorful quote. I'm surprised I had forgotten it, but that's back to your term of that politics becomes a form of self-expression. It also becomes a form of deriving a sense of moral satisfaction. George Orwell was a socialist, and he was also someone who understood the evils of totalitarianism and fascism. So he, to your earlier point that both the center left and the progressive left are correct, he, by anyone's stretch of the imagination, was more of a progressive leftist because he was a socialist. But he understood that lesser of two evil thinking is still quite important, because the threat of totalitarianism, particularly fascism, isn't anything to take lightly. And if his leftist brethren, weren't engaged in the system and weren't engaged with actual methods of tactical change that can bear fruit, then it becomes just a form of intellectual masturbation in which people adopt positions because it feels good and because they are able to claim a mantle of purity. I will not interact with the corrupt system because I cannot risk blemishing my moral resume. So Orwell was describing that form of distraction that isn't really political, but it becomes a substitute for that which is political. Aristotle defined politics as that which relates to the collective, relates to the community. And Aristotle further explained that the community is that which gives a person a chance at a good life. So if one is not directly participating in that which can improve the community, then one isn't participating in politics. To your point, I have plenty of reasons for demoralization. I mean, I agree with you. We have, Whitney says hello, I suppose. We have this living in this armed madhouse where gun violence threatens presumably all of us when we're in a grocery store or an entertainment venue or a school. We have continual disparities that cost people their lives in healthcare and in our macro and micro economies. We have an education system that routinely fails to provide even an adequate education to the poorest of the poor and often the working class as well. But here's another point that I would add. Part of how the fan fiction left is able to thrive, and the Jimmy Dores and others, is a commitment to, through omission, denying that any progress has occurred in our lifetimes. Despair immobilizes people, to refer back to that Rustin quote. Despair freezes people when they're trying to take action. Hope enlivens people, and oftentimes the genesis of hope is the acknowledgement of the progress that we've already made and the lives that have improved as a result. So if we just look in my lifetime, I mean, we went from the idea of gay marriage seeming like something only a psychotic would advocate, to now the law of the land, and despite some right-wing objection to it, I'm sure, pretty much mainstream in most of the United States, pretty much taken for granted. We have the Affordable Care Act, which I already mentioned, giving millions of people access to healthcare for the first time. We have women continually, even though there are so many sexist obstacles that still exist, continuing to amass more opportunities and more positions of leadership. We have racial minorities, despite the horrors that we could see on television with police brutality and other concerns, running major cities of the United States. And becoming a cultural force of insight and awareness from everything from the entertainment world to athletics, and then all the way into the educational system. And so much of what we're seeing right now in states like Florida and Tennessee and Texas, whether they're banning books or banning drag shows, is a backlash to a United States of America that is rapidly changing. And through that rapid change, finding political, educational, cultural, and financial ways to include more people and to broaden liberty and prosperity so that the full polity of the United States has opportunities to exercise citizenship and to contribute to the making and molding of our society. So another characteristic that you could identify of the fan fiction left is just the continual of denial, even if it's through omission, of any progress that has occurred. When the progress is transpiring all around us, and we should be seeking opportunities to build on that progress, to enlarge and expand it, rather than acting as if we have an all or nothing binary choice. Because if we're doing that, then we're committing the offense that Orwell so colorfully put. We're just in an act of political, intellectual masturbation. It's something that makes us feel good in the moment, but it's counterproductive to the aims of the progressive movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess they also will sometimes do the opposite viewpoint about change, and that is to think that it's inevitable, to think that, well, you just have to put this out there and then it'll win because the people agree with it, and so therefore it will win. Well, that's not how politics works. Change is not inevitable. We've come a long way, but it also was through effort. It wasn't through waving a magical wand.
Yeah, it was from powerful social movements led and staffed by committed people who oftentimes risk their lives and risk their livelihoods in service of change. And I wrote a book about one of those civil rights leaders, Jesse Jackson. One thinks of all of the change that he helped to administer and that he witnessed throughout his life. Most obvious of which is, of course, the civil rights for Black Americans. But he was the first presidential candidate to make gay rights a pivotal part of his campaign. In 1984, when he first ran and spoke consistently about gay rights, most Democrats weren't even adopting those positions. And now someone would be run out of the Democratic Party if they said they opposed LGBTQ rights. And as you're saying, that didn't happen by happenstance, and it didn't happen according to immutable laws of physics. It was because of people whose names we know, like Jesse Jackson and like Harvey Milk. But it was also because of thousands, if not millions, of people whose names we won't know, who used the tools of constitutional democracy, starting with the vote, but also including the protest and the boycott and the petition and the seeking office themselves and external agitation when the system failed to incorporate their voices and perspective to achieve these objectives. And, one can't help but wonder what some of this new breed of left-wing pundit, what they would have us do now. And you notice that that's something that's also, aside from force the vote, there are never any productive recommendations for what we could do to improve the system, other than withholding votes from Democrats under the misguided belief that if they do that, it will somehow force Democrats to become much more progressive in order to regain those lost left-wing voters. That is a theory. It isn't one that is supported by evidence, and it isn't one that is likely to turn out well, because if one advocates for the withdrawal of voting for Democrats, then one is operationally right-wing, because the end result of that method of change is more Republicans in power. And then we're back to playing defense against abuses of people who I would hope we're all trying to protect and promote and empower and advance.
Yeah. Well, and it's the other kind of related to that is also that, you know, and you did talk about this also in your CNN essay, is that when in the pre-World War II era, you mentioned a guy named Ernst Thalmann, who was the leader of Germany's radical left in the Weimar years. And for him, he thought that the center left was more dangerous than Adolf Hitler. And it's really kind of illustrative that we're seeing people nowadays making this exact same mistake, that they just say, oh, well, white nationalism is just this fringe phenomenon, or these are just people who they're populist. And the answer is they're not actually populist. This is fake. The elites don't believe it. And I think maybe in some cases you could say that some of these, especially Obama to Trump voters, as they're called, some of those people might actually have, left of center economic viewpoints. But the elites at the very top, like Josh Hawley or Donald Trump or, Rick Santorum, these are people who want a centralized government telling other people what to do, taking away religious freedom, taking away the freedom to be, trans in public, taking away same-sex marriage rights. These are not populist ideas. These are people who oppose the minimum wage. Like in Missouri, they actually passed a law, and they got away with it. To the city of St. Louis had increased their minimum wage. Missouri Republicans overrode their law and literally lowered the minimum wage. That's what Republicans are doing. And if you are deluding yourself that these are populists that you're allying with, you're nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw this happen in Germany, as I write about in my essay, and I also refer to it in the essay I wrote for the New Republic on the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. presidential campaign.
We'll get to that one in a second.
And it's, I mean, these are perhaps the people who are more sincere, because they're coming from a Marxist position, and they believe that if the center left is the only obstruction remaining against radical social change, because their theory of change is that gradual change helps to mask and disguise the contradictions and failures of the system. So if you remove those who are advocating for gradual change and those who are achieving gradual change from power, then the contradictions of this, it will heighten the contradictions of the system, and the masses will see it, and then suddenly they'll realize that capitalism is the problem, and we'll have a revolution in the streets. That didn't work out so well for Western Europe and the rest of the world, and it wouldn't work out so well now, because, as you're saying, the Republicans have taken a pretty dangerous turn. I'm not sure if it's a turn, but it's more of an acceleration. They always had these elements within their party, but they've accelerated in that direction. And perhaps it's, one doesn't miss the water until the well runs dry. But if you think things are bad now, even the decadent status quo is preferable to fascism. This is not populism that we're seeing. It's not conservatism any longer, but it is a form of fascism, neo-fascism. And if one isn't comfortable with that term, well, then it's at least autocracy or authoritarianism.
Or a reaction.
Yeah. Yes, a reactionary set of politics that is increasingly promotional of violence as a political tool, as hate crimes rise annually against Jews, Latinos, LGBTQ Americans, Blacks, Asians. We see how various Republican leaders in Congress downplay the significance of January 6th, and therefore, in a roundabout way or directly support the subversion of electoral democracy. We see how many states are passing voter suppression laws and gerrymandering. So all of these Americans who constitutional democracy, despite its flaws and despite its need for improvement, has begun to represent and empower, have their political autonomy, and in some cases their lives on the line, if this dangerous extremist right-wing movement continues to gather force and gain power. And the Democratic Party, for better and in some cases for worse, is the last remaining safeguard against that movement. So the objective should be to make the Democratic Party better, not abandon it. And,
Yeah,
and
well,
I would say there's
yeah.
sorry to cut you off, but you mentioned the populist. One of the myths that the mainstream media, ironically, because these kinds of pundits we're discussing comport themselves as radically opposed to the mainstream media, but the mainstream media created this myth that the average Trump voter is an reincarnation of Tom Joad, that the average Trump voter is some kind of downtrodden victim of corporate America, a victim of poor trade deals, and is attracted to Trump because of some kind of anti-corporate, anti-institutional power message. None of the evidence bears that out. All of the data contradict it.
Hey, thanks for watching the discussion here today. This discussion goes on for quite a bit more, so go to theoryofchange.show to get full access to the video, audio, and transcript. And you can subscribe on Patreon or on Substack, and you can get full access. So please do that, and I look forward to letting you see the rest of the conversation. Thanks so much.